Everybody's asking, where's Terry? I'll explain why I don't think Falcons GM Terry Fontenot should have that prominent a role in the search for a new head coach.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. AKA. And of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast that makes it your first listen or watch of the day. And if you want to become an everydayer throughout the 2024 offseason, make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we'll be talking about what I think the Falcons' problems have been under Arthur Blank and Rich McKay and whether those guys are responsible for it. We'll talk about the true downfall, the bad bet that Arthur Smith made, and it's not necessarily the bet on Desmond Ridder. But we'll start things off talking about, what a lot of people have been talking about these last couple of days since Monday's postseason presser between Rich McKay and Arthur Blank that did not include Terry Fontenot. And we'll get into that, answering a question from Mike, aka Grim57 from the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below. And he asks, how many other NFL organizations don't let the general manager hire the head coach? Terry Fontenot will be, quote unquote, included in the conversation, but Blank and McKay will lead the search. Also, Rich McKay hasn't gotten the axe. Also, McKay was hired after Bobby Petrino's season and hired Mike Smith, Quinn, and Arthur Smith. McKay was the point person on the new stadium, but it seems like he needs to stick to that side of the organization. So, answering your question, how many NFL teams don't let the GM hire the head coach? Pretty much all of them don't do that. Right. And again, I won't pretend to know the ins and outs of every NFL team, but I spoke about this earlier this week with my guest, Jeff Schultz, and looking at the 14 current playoff teams, I don't think a single one had the head coach hired directly by the general manager. And I'm looking around the rest of the league, I don't feel like any of the other active coaches in the NFL are that way. Right. Now, you certainly have certain teams that have general managers that maybe have more influence in the room, so to speak, than others do. Maybe Philadelphia's Howie Roseman might have been a bigger part of the process there than maybe some other teams' GMs were in their head coaching hire. But the sort of notion of the sort of handpicked head coach being the choice of the general manager, that's not really the case anymore in the NFL. That's, and that's what I discussed with Jeff, right? That basically head coaches and GMs now are kind of co-leads in these organizations, right? Frankly, the days of the GM being sort of the top decision maker, the big decider in an organization is a relic of the past, right? Like there's a lot of young new GMs in the league that have come in the league in the last couple of years, and a lot of these guys are like pro and college scouting directors and not really like guys that can sort of dictate, right? I think there's like 5 teams that have GMs that have been in their current position for a decade or more. That's the Saints, the Seahawks, the Eagles, the Rams, and the Bucks. And I thought one of the more poignant things that Rich McKay and Arthur Blank said in their Monday presser was about how, NFL teams work today, right? That these are basically billion-dollar corporations, and sort of the sort of mom and pop where only a handful of people are sort of running the show, it doesn't exist anymore, right? Like these corporations that are NFL teams, they're no different than Coca-Cola or Frito-Lay or whatever, but, the product that they produce is 17 football games. And while I'm not a business guy, all these corporations have this board, and, the owner isn't really the CEO. The owner is more, because they're not really doing the day-to-day stuff, right? They delegate that to stuff. They're more like the founder or the chairman, the biggest shareholder. And so when it's time for a big decision to be made, what they say goes, because they're in that, but they're not running the day-to-day of the company. Sort of the face of the company is really what the CEO is basically the head coach. And basically, again, using this business analogy, if you have a bad quarterly report, if your product, you don't win enough football games, isn't good enough, they're going to push you out and get a new CEO. And then, there's other board members, and that includes the GM, like a Terry Fontenot. That includes team presidents. Like every team has a team president. Like 2/3 of the league have team presidents, and the other third of the league, basically the team president is the owner, the son of the owner, or the daughter of the owner, right? But the Falcons have two team presidents, one for football, one for business. Greg Beatles is the business guy. He got hired last year. Rich McKay is the football side of things. And Rich McKay sort of is the head of the football side of things, but he doesn't really run anything, right? He's not really making football decisions. He hasn't made football decisions really for 15 years, right? He's basically the guy that has boots on the ground that oversees the day-to-day stuff to make sure, everything's running smoothly, making sure that the building's not on fire. But, part of the reason why he has that role is because 8 years ago, Arthur Blank, was forced to deal with some health issues due to prostate cancer and basically had to take a step back from doing the day-to-day stuff of all his businesses, including the Atlanta Falcons. And basically McKay's role is to be that sort of liaison, that eyes and ears for Arthur Smith to oversee the day-to-day stuff, but he's not really making the decisions, right? When you have these billion-dollar corporations, someone has to make sure that these things are running smoothly, right? Because this stuff matters, right? Billions of dollars are at stake. So, when people say, like, why is McKay still here? I don't understand why that's a question, right? And, some of your facts, Mike, are a little wrong, right? McKay was hired in 2004, so he was responsible for the Moore and Petrino hire. Then he was stripped of football decision makings after that Petrino fiasco in 2008. And he basically spent the next decade, as you say, running the business side of things, getting that stadium built. And then after the stadium got built, he was like, I got that itch to get back to the football side of things, but he's not a decider. He's not a decision maker. Right. But I do think he should be front and center, the point man, whatever you want to call it, as part of the process to hire a head coach. Because if you put him, Arthur Blank, and Terry Fontenot in a room and ask, hey, raise your hand if you've hired a Hall of Fame head coach. Rich McKay is the only person that's going to raise his hand because he hired Tony Dungy. Raise your hand if you've hired a Super Bowl winning head coach. Rich McKay's hand's going to go up. John Gruden. Raise your hand if you've hired a coach that has gone to the Super Bowl. McKay and Blank will say that because Dan Quinn. What has Terry done? Terry spent basically a decade or 15 years at the Saints organization, essentially as a pro scout, basically in middle management. Why should he be leading the charge for the Falcons coaching search? And I don't say this to bash Terry Fontenot. I think he's a very important component of the Falcons organization, right? That I don't think he's the driving force behind every personnel decision, but those personnel decisions don't really happen without his approval. That's the job of the GM. But I see all this foaming at the mouth anti or pro Terry Fontenot sentiment from some in the fan base, some media folks, and I don't think it's really merited, right? I think if you're paying any amount of attention, that the Falcons personnel moves have largely been coach driven over the last 3 years. We've talked a ton about all these players that the Falcons have signed that had previous experience with past coaches. We spent all of last year joking about how the Falcons kept bringing all these ex-Bears. Was that Terry Fontenot or was that Ryan Pace? Ryan Pace being the shadow general manager that we joked about. And so, Terry's fine. He's fine. He's doing thumbs up, right? But there's no reason for people to be fired up about Terry Fontenot pro or against. And I know going back to the conversation we had with Jeff Schultz earlier this week, he mentioned that, the Falcons should be hiring that sort of top guy that can make those football decisions, that can, do that stuff, that can be more involved in Rich McKay. Right. And I didn't really push back because I got to make a tight 30 on these episodes. And I don't think today is going to be a tight 30. But, my follow-up question to Jeff would have been who's really more qualified out there to do that job than Rich McKay? Bill Belichick? Right. Good luck with that, I say. Right. You might be still mad about a poor coaching hire that Rich McKay made 17 years ago, but, you're ignoring the terrible offensive coordinator hire that Bill Belichick made a year ago. All right. Much worse, in my opinion. Again, maybe I'm biased. Than the Bobby Petrino hire. At least there was justifiable reasons for that. Matt Patricia, Joe Judge, calling plays for the first time ever. There's no justifiable reasons for that. But again, Rich McKay's not really making those decisions. He's not that overseeing guy. He's basically making sure the building's not on fire. And I don't think that role should be the head coach or the GM should have that role. They got bigger fish to fry. They got to make sure the product in this billion-dollar corporation is good on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. And so someone in the Discord responded to Mike's question, basically saying, let Terry cook. And I'm like, you can have Terry in the kitchen. He can cut some veggies. He can boil some water, but I don't think he should be the head chef, right? No NFL teams are doing it. So that being said, I've seen a lot of rhetoric over the last couple of days, in weeks, Rich McKay, Arthur Blank is the problem. I don't really agree with that, as I'm seemingly explaining. But the Falcons do have a problem. And it's the tendency that they get 90% of the way to their goal and they can't get over that hump. But it's not because some individual like Rich McKay or Arthur Blank or Arthur Smith or whoever is holding them back. It's because I think the nature of football makes it very hard to get over that hump. And I'll explain that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. And, it's the new year. We get obsessed with how to change ourselves rather than just sort of expanding on the things that we already do right. And therapy can help you find your strengths so that you can ditch the extreme resolutions and make the changes that really stick. I've done therapy with BetterHelp. It's taught me things like I can control what I can control. And I think if you're thinking about starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely done online. It's much more affordable than traditional offline therapy. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you gotta do is fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist, usually within 48 hours. And you can switch therapists at any time thereafter for no additional charge if, that person isn't the right fit for you. So celebrate the progress you've made with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/lockedon, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So continuing today's episode, want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, getting all the biggest stories in all the leagues across the world, across the nation. And if you want that local flavor, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel to get, the lowdown on all your Georgia and Atlanta-based sports. So constantly here, seeing the comments on many of my videos this week, Rich McKay and Arthur Blank are the problem. Some people focus on McKay, some people focus on Blank, a lot of people focus on both. Now, the Falcons do have a problem that has occurred over the 20 years that those guys have sort of overseen this organization, right? And that problem is that they have a tendency to get 90% away to their goal, whatever that is, and they struggle to break through that last 10%. And whether we're talking about, coaches reaching, the conference championship game and not getting that over the hump to the Super Bowl, coaches getting to the Super Bowl, not getting over that hump to win the Super Bowl, coaches getting to the playoffs and, like Mike Smith in his early years, not winning a playoff game. Or in this year's case, Arthur Smith getting 90% of the way to making the playoffs, but not getting over that hump to get there, right? Because when we talk about the 90% that the Falcons had in 2023, that's basically representing, that 10% that was left on the table, left on the bone, was basically 2 wins away from basically this episode that I'm recording right now should be a crossover episode with Locked On Eagles to get you prepped for this wild card weekend. And when you look at those 2 games, you can pick any 2, but you essentially could easily come up with like a handful of plays, like 4 plays across 2 games, your pick, that were the difference between the Falcons making the playoffs and not, right? The Falcons were 4-6 this year in 1-score games. They go 6-4, they're in the playoffs, right? And you can look at several games, Minnesota, Arizona, look at 1 or 2 plays. Hey, you tackle Josh Dobbs, you tackle Kyler Murray, you potentially win those games. Minnesota, Taylor Heineke makes that throw in the final minute to set up the potential field goal that can send that game into overtime. Carolina, Desmond Ridder doesn't throw that pick that leads to the 95-yard drive by Carolina. Tampa Bay, take your pick, right? Take away the safety, take away any of Koo's missed field goals, and the end of that game goes very differently, right? Where the Falcons are potentially setting up for a game-winning field goal to win that game. So you can take your pick, right? But basically what I'm saying is the Falcons were this close. And for the audio listeners, my fingers are an inch apart when it comes to how close they were to making the playoffs. And yet one of the comments I've seen earlier this week was Arthur Smith was a failure. And it's like clearly how you define failure and how I define failure when you're basically this close to success are different, right? And this is what I talk about when we're talking about scapegoats and being reductive, where I think people like to, look at the Falcons coming up this short and being like, it's this person's fault, whether that's the owner, whether that's the GM, formerly in Rich McKay, Thomas Dimitroff, or the current GM or the coach, right? I just think shortcomings are a nature of football, right? Winning football games is hard. So many things have to go right for you to have success in this sport. That's how the sport works, right? And I don't think a lot of people that follow the sport, whether they're fans or media that cover the sport, really understand that concept on a fundamental level. And let's compare football to other sports like basketball and baseball. Baseball is basically a 1v1 sport, pitcher versus batter, right? There's 8 other guys on the field, but because of how rare hits are, like 60% of the time or more, right? They don't really matter. They're just taking up space. Like the batter hitting the ball, the pitcher getting a strike has, what the first baseman is doing, just scratching his butt, has nothing to do with him. And you look at basketball, yeah, it's 5v5, but often it transforms into a 1v1 sport, ISO ball, right? Basically, you're a player. You can decide, I'm going to take the ball down the court, I'm going to shoot it. And, the other, that one guy guarding me's got to deal with it, but the other 8 guys on the court, go stand in the corner, right? We saw the late, great Kobe Bryant, basically like, I'm going to get 81. You're not going to stop me. 1v1 game, right? Or, in that case, 1v5. He got everybody in that game. But you can't really play that. That's not how football works, right? If you're a ball carrier, you can't just say, I'm gonna run this to the end zone, because you got 11 guys. It's 1 versus 11. And you need your 10 other teammates to take out at least 10 of those guys, so that then you get in the position of a 1v1. Now, there are 1v1 elements in football, wide receiver versus corner or whatever, tackle versus DN. But if you're a wide receiver, you need the offensive line, the 5 guys on the offensive line, to hold up to get the quarterback the time. And you need the quarterback to make the throw in order for you to do your job, right? It's basically 11 links in the chain. And if one of those links goes wrong, it kind of breaks the whole thing. The whole thing breaks down. And guess what? 10 out of 11, it's about 90%, right? But, that's part of the reason why we blame a player. But, the more and more you watch football, the more you notice like all these players break down, right? That's part of my job here, is to basically tell you which links in the chain are consistently weak. That's why we need to go upgrade this position. We need to go upgrade this position in the offseason. We need to draft this. We need to sign this, right? But it's just kind of random variability on when those links in the chain weaken, right? And some of the reasons why we don't often see eye to eye on our perspective on this football team is, I think, when those things break down, I think there's a tendency among folks to think there's nefarious things going on. Like, for example, Devontae Freeman missing that block in the Super Bowl. And if you watch enough football, you know that running backs blow protections every single game. It happens in every game. But because you can't accept the idea that random variability, basically stuff happens sometimes in football, you have to come up with this convoluted conspiracy, he blew that block on purpose or whatever, that I've seen so many fans do over the last 7 years, right? And you got 22 players on 130 plays in a given game for 17 games. That's basically meaning that you have nearly 50,000 variables that determine the outcome of a season. And as I just said, you can only control what you can control. And one person being able to control those 50,000 variables doesn't exist. At most, a single individual, a single link in that chain might control 1%, maybe 2% of those variables, given 1,000, 500,000 plays. That's part of the reason why football is a game of inches. Little things change, tweak one of those variables, and you get different outcomes. And so until you get that on a fundamental level, I don't think you really understand the sport. And it's why, I don't hold 17-year grudges. It's why I don't get butthurt about games that played years ago, because I understand a lot of times it's random chaos. Stuff happens, man. That's life. But our brains aren't really wired to process 50,000 variables. We got 10 fingers, and so maybe we can process 10 variables. But for most people, it's so much easier to focus on one. And I'll get off my soapbox, but I wanted to say that because I look at the 90% problems the Falcons have, and I don't say it's one individual that's holding back the team. That's basically what I'm saying. It's just that's just football, man. Sometimes you get 90% of the way there and you come up short. That's just how the game is. But we'll talk about some of the real reasons behind the downfall of Arthur Smith to sort of wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, it's a new year, and maybe your resolution is to be better prepared in 2024, and especially now during flu season. Getting sick can kind of derail things. I myself recently battled with a bout of COVID, but if you're trying to be in your best preparation, making sure you have access to life-saving medications means something, right? And Jase Medical is here for you, especially now that the FDA has recently released statements about a shortage on antibiotics, and Jase Medical has the Jase case, where you get a pack of 5 different antibiotics that treat a long list, 50 plus bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory, sinus infections, so much more. Visit jasemedical.com, and a board-certified physician will review what you need, and a licensed pharmacy will send you the medications at a fraction of their regular cost. And it's more important now than ever to be prepared today. So go to jasemedical.com and use offer code Locked On, and you'll get $20 off your order. That's JASE medical.com, promo code Locked On for $20 off. So I know some of you guys were looking for the All 22 review this week, and we'll get there. It's probably going to come out Saturday. So continue to make us your first listen. We'll have Jarvis on. I'll reach out to Jarvis and see his availability so he can weigh in on this topic. But let's talk about the downfall of the Smith regime. And this stems from a question from the Discord from Luke Jones. He asked, "Hey, Aaron, since we're starting," and he asked this before the season finale, "Say, Aaron, since we're staring 7-10 in the face for a third consecutive season in Arthur Smith era maybe coming to an end, what were some of the biggest decisions that led to the downfall of this regime? Positional value zigging, lack of investment at quarterback, bad self-evaluations, not filling needs, etc." I think probably the overwhelming narrative, the most pervasive narrative that you're going to see and hear, and probably many of you think, is that Arthur Smith got fired because he made a terrible bet on Desmond Ridder, right? And that cost him his job. And while I'm not going to say that was a good bet, I'm not going to say that wasn't a major contributing factor to why he's out of a job right now. I don't think that's really the real bet that Arthur Smith made that led to his downfall, right? The Falcons basically made the bet on Desmond Ridder because they basically believed that they didn't need elite quarterback play because the engine of this offense would be their run game, right? And so if we're going to take a second to be reductive, right? 50% of their problem was the quarterback play, and the other 50% was their inability to the run game letting them down, right? Now, the quarterback play is particularly with the quarterbacks putting the ball in the hard lanes. That's both Ridder and Heineke. That consistently was a problem. But you saw significant regression from this run game this past season. And we talked about it all off season, right? You weren't betting on Desmond Ridder being a top 10 quarterback. You were betting on him basically being like the 19th best quarterback in the league. And given the run game, elite run game in a top defense, that was good enough, especially against this schedule, to think that you would make the playoffs. And the defense held up their end of the bargain, but the run game did not. Now, when you look at like adjusted net yards per attempt, or ANYA, right? That 19 figure comes from basically where the Falcons in 21 under Matt Ryan were the 19th most efficient passing game in the league. Now, Ryan as an individual quarterback ranked 18th. In 22, they were the 17th most efficient passing game in the league. Mariota as an individual ranked 22 in the league, right? And so you ask, where did Ridder rank, right? Overall, the Falcons were the 22nd most efficient passing attack in the league, and Ridder was the 23rd ranked quarterback in that metric, adjusted net yards per attempt, right? And, you know where Ridder ranked the first time he got benched? He was 20th at that point in the season. So it goes back to what I'm talking about, the 90%, right? Like basically you got 90% of the way with the quarterback with your expectations, or at least my expectations. Maybe your expectations were much higher. So like you're going to hear me, like I'm not going to buy into this notion in this narrative that some people will push that Ridder was this utter disaster, right? And I hope you now understand why I'm not going to, because again, you got 90% of the way there. But let's look at some stats to look at the run game, and that's regression throughout the season, right? Now, you might look at the yards per game and say, well, we were third in rushing in 22 and we were ninth in 23. How big a drop off is that? But, you guys got to get into the 21st century. There's this thing called the internet, and you have access to all the knowledge in the world, and you can't judge football on volume stats like it's 1996, right? You got to look at some more advanced metrics that tell the true story, because not all yards are created equal, right? You look at DVOA. They were third in rushing in 22. They were 22nd in 23. You look at expected points added, or EPA, depending on what source you look at, but my preferred source had the Falcons fourth in EPA per rush in 22, 28th in 23. So top 5 to bottom 5 in that metric. And you look at success rate, right? And success rate, general success rate, not EPA success rate, but general success rate looks at rushing efficiency on a down and distance. It's far superior than yards per carry, right? But by the way, the Falcons were like, I think 4th in yards per carry last year and 16th this year. But And that's part of the reason why they dropped off, because they didn't get the explosive runs, and that's really what EPA is looking at. But you look at success rate. A successful run is a 40% of the yards to gain on first down, 60% on second down, 100% on third and fourth down. And when it comes to the running game, these is what you need to get to keep your offense on schedule, and that's basically the point of the running game, right? Because it's a passing league. Passing is king, but your run game is supposed to supplement your passing attacking and put them in advantageous situations. Falcons success rate in 2022 was 56%, dominant success rate. Dropped off to 46%. And we're just talking about success rate on handoffs to your running backs. Now, 46% is a healthy rushing rate. Anything above 45% is healthy for the run game, but it's still a massive drop off. And you compare that 46% in 23 to the previous years prior to 2022. In 21, that was 43%. In 2020, that was 48%. In 2019, it was 44%. And so essentially, the Falcons' run game in this past season was about as effective as the run game was in the Dirk Cutter years, when they did not have a run game that could sustain their offense. Now, in those years, you had Matt Ryan, you had Julio Jones, you had Calvin Ridley, so you could easily pivot when the run game wasn't working. You didn't have that, right? Obviously, you didn't have the same caliber of quarterback play. And, no knock on Drake London and Kyle Pitts, but they're not on the level of Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley yet. We'll say that. We'll say that with a caveat. Yeah, maybe they'll get there. We'll see. But the Falcons bet on the run game and quickly realized pretty early on in the season that it wasn't going to be the engine of the offense, and they tried to pivot. I'll give them that credit, right? One of my knocks towards the end of the Mike Smith era was they didn't pivot away from how they wanted to play in 2013 and 2014, and that was a downfall of them. But at least Arthur Smith and company recognized that they needed to pivot, and that's why they benched Matt Collins. That's why they traded for Van Jefferson. It didn't work, right? Van Jefferson was a non-factor. But when you go back to success rate, right, you look at how many games in 2022 did they have a success rate of 45% or higher, right? That sort of reliable, successful, healthy run game. 15. How many of those games did they have in 23? 8. How many games did they have where their success rate was over 60%, which basically meant they were able to dominate the game on the ground? That's what a 60% success rate is telling you. In 22, they had 7 of those games. In 23, that was 1 game. That was the Week 12 game against the Saints. And so the Falcons were basically betting on, for a larger chunk of the season, that they were going to play like they did against the Saints, where, again, that game was run-heavy, defensive-driven game, right? Getting all those stops in the red zone. And even though the quarterback turned the ball over in that game, it didn't matter, because that's what the Falcons were betting on. They were going to be able to play that way consistently all throughout the season, and they were only able to basically do that like one time. And then you can, the first Bucs game, they got close to it, other games, Packers, etc. But like, that was basically the downfall of this regime. Now, turnovers to me were an issue every single week, but I would probably argue that there was maybe like 8 games where the turnovers really, really were backbreaking for this team. They had to work to overcome it pretty much every other game, but like, where it was like, man, that really killed us. Those turnovers were really killing us. They really made it hard for us to win that game. But I think there was basically an equal number of games where the run game basically didn't show up to the degree that it needed to be the engine of the offense. And so I think that regression was due to the blocking. We talked about it all year long, right? 3 out of the 4 returning starters on your offensive line were worse run blockers than they were the previous year. Jake Matthews, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry. And then Matthew Bergeron was a downgrade from all the revolving door of left guards you had the year before. Basically, Drew Dalman is the only player that maintained, right? Parker Hesse agenda. You play an outside zone run scheme like the Falcons do, and the Falcons are the most committed team to the outside zone run scheme. You have to have good perimeter blocking from your tight ends. And the Falcons didn't have that this year. They had it last year due to Parker Hesse. They didn't have it because Pitts, Jonnu Smith were often liabilities in that regard. And Michael Pruitt, for outside of like 2 or 3 games, was basically, a non-factor and, zero entity. Not adding a ton of value, not adding, not taking away a ton of value, but basically, was out there being the first baseman, scratching his butt, not doing anything, like we talked about in baseball. And so when you talk about the roster moves that the Falcons made, I'm not saying that these were the cause, right? This first example, I'm not saying this was a bad pick, but taking Bijan Robinson was emblematic of that bet that the Falcons were making. And I don't think it was a bad bet. Again, even if you thought the run game would regress a little bit, I don't think you thought they would go from top 5 to bottom 5. You might top 5 to 10 or something like that. And that still would have been more than good enough for this offense to work this year. And again, I'm not saying that he's the blame, but, the Falcons' decision to sign Matt Collins as the number 2 wide receiver was emblematic of this bet that they were making. Because, if you want a blocker, Matt Collins is your guy. And basically, for most of the season, that's basically what Matt Collins' role was, especially when the Falcons realized about a month into the season that he wasn't going to be able to provide the things. And that's why you saw Jefferson come in. That's why you saw increased snaps for Scotty Miller and Kadero Hodge doing more of the heavy lifting in the passing game, because you needed to add more juice and more speed to the offense, right? And it's part of the reason why, much to my guy Jarvis Davis's chagrin, wide receiver is going to be potentially a legit option for the Falcons to take in the first round of the draft, right? Replacing Arthur Smith isn't resolving that issue. That's still an issue, an ongoing issue. That's one of the top needs for this football team. So I hope, Luke, that answers your question. Again, we can go deeper and deeper into this, and I'm sure we will continue to explore this topic in the coming days, weeks, and whatnot, months as well. But I hope that answers your question. I think ultimately it boils down to, yes, the quarterback play was a problem, but the Falcons bet on the run game, and that bet, I don't think that was a bad bet, but it didn't work in their favor, and that's led to, the downfall of Arthur Smith, and, they got 90% of the way there, and they just couldn't get over that hump. But I hope that resolves your question. We'll see if we can, I'll text Jarvis and see if he's available tomorrow. He can weigh in on his coaching search. Obviously, lots of moving parts. Pete Carroll, Mike Vrabel, right? Nick Saban's going to retire. All these 70-year-old coaches going by the wayside. So we'll see what's what on tomorrow's episode. And please stay in touch for the All 22 review later this week. Continue to make us your first listen. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, 24/7 streaming channel. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.